All right, so as we head into this decade of the 1960s, there's a ton of different stuff to cover in this one. I may actually use the visuals a little bit, put some of those on there too, just so you can get some of the individual pieces. There are some people that refer to the 1960s as kind of a second period of civil war in the United States. Like I said, there's just tons of stuff that we're going to be taking a look at. Want to do it through really three presidents during this period of time. We've got John F. Kennedy, who we're going to talk about now. We've got Lyndon Johnson, and then Richard Nixon, who's going to come in as kind of the last president of the 1960s. Now, the interesting thing is there's the decade of the 60s, so basically 1960 to 1969, and then there's the era of the 60s. It's kind of what we think of when we think about hippies and Vietnam and that sort of thing. That doesn't actually start, or historians kind of mark that from the death of John Kennedy. So that's 1963. His presidency was really kind of a golden time in the United States. They referred to his administration as Camelot, trying to call back like themes of King Arthur and that sort of thing. And so we want to look and see what happened there. And then a lot of people say that the turmoil that comes in the 1960s comes out of this kind of ideal image just being destroyed. Uh, John F. Kennedy, I'm going to put the video up for you on the playlist here. So it'll be waiting on you just kind of the same way we did in the modern civil rights movement. But John Kennedy is elected president in 1960. We saw him just really briefly in World War II. He was a hero in World War II, had been wounded. He was a Navy PT boat captain. He comes back to his home state of Massachusetts and he gets involved in politics. And he's a congressman and a senator from the state of Massachusetts. He's a young, good-looking guy, vibrant personality, really good public speaker. And so in 1960, he gets the Democratic nomination for President of the United States. The guy he's going to run against is Richard Nixon. Now, Richard Nixon had spent the last 8 years, from 1952 to 1960, being the vice president of the United States. So a whole lot more people would have heard of Richard Nixon than had heard of John F. Kennedy. And what's going to help increase Kennedy's exposure is that the two men are going to agree to the first televised debates in American presidential history. And so Nixon and Kennedy are going to meet a couple of different times to talk about the issues. And really, if you look at the debates themselves, it's not so much substance, it's style that comes through. If you heard the debates on the radio back then, they said you thought probably Nixon won. But if you saw it on television, people thought Kennedy won. He was a younger guy. He was tanned, well rested. Just came off better on television than Richard Nixon did. And this ends up being one of the closest elections in American history. And a lot of people give the Nixon-Kennedy debates kind of credit for pushing Kennedy over the top. So when he becomes president, there are a couple of big events that we're going to take a look at. I've got them listed there for you on the screen. The first is what's called the Bay of Pigs. One of the big problems in the early 1960s was the country of Cuba. Now, if you want to pause for a second and pull up a map, you'll see Cuba is about 90 miles south of Florida. And in the 1950s, we had helped with a revolution in Cuba, and a man named Fidel Castro had come into power. And we thought he was going to be an ally of the United States. Didn't work out that way. He actually became an ally of the Soviet Union, which obviously in the middle of the Cold War isn't working out very well for us. And so there had been a plan under the Eisenhower administration to train a group of Cuban refugees, these guys who had come to Florida give them some military training and some military support for them to go in and to take back over the country of Cuba. Well, when we send these guys back in, the United States doesn't send the air cover. The whole thing is just really a mess. Like I said, I'll include a video there for you so you can get a little more into detail with this if you'd like. And it really gives the Kennedy administration a black eye just kind of at the beginning. Everybody was looking at this guy and thinking he's really young and inexperienced, and this doesn't do anything to change people's minds. He does take responsibility for it. Probably would have been easy to shift that onto the Eisenhower administration, said, hey, this wasn't even our plan. But like I said, it leads to a rocky start. And it's not the only problem he's going to have with Cuba. In October of 1961, the Cubans, or the Russian Soviets, are going to send, or I guess sneak, missiles into Cuba, nuclear missiles capable of reaching pretty much any place in the United States very, very quickly. And so obviously that's a big threat. And so there's something that goes on called the Cuban Missile Crisis. Got a whole keynote on that one that we're going to take a look at. So I want to pull that out separate. It's the closest our country ever came to nuclear war. So we'll check that out in another one of these talks. Kennedy is also the president who is given credit for starting the space race. Now we're going to talk about space, and the Soviets are actually the first country to put an object into space and a man into space. But President Kennedy is going to give a famous speech in the 60s where he kind of sets the finish line for the space race. He says, we're going to get to the moon, and we're going to get to the moon before the end of the decade. Now the crazy thing is that technology does not exist. When he's given that speech in the early 1960s, there's nothing to suggest that we have the capabilities of getting to the moon. He wasn't worried about that. He's a leader pointing the direction, says, hey, we're going to invest time, we're going to invest money and resources into this, and we want to be on the moon. And it happens. 1969, July of 1969, the United States becomes the first nation to send people to the moon, the only nation so far that has done that. Here's a little clip of Kennedy's space race speech.
I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the earth. No single space project in this period will be more impressive to mankind or more important for the long-range exploration of space, and none will be so difficult or expensive to accomplish.
Like I said, the interesting thing is the capability isn't there yet. Now, John Kennedy in the 1950s had gotten married. Like I said, he's a younger man to be president of the United States. At that point, he was the youngest man to be elected president. He got married a little later in life to a lady by the name of Jacqueline Bouvier, Jackie Kennedy, and his wife was a rock star in the 1960s. There's this young, good-looking couple. They have a couple of small children in the White House. Had a daughter, Caroline, and a son they called John. And they're kids. Like there were famous pictures of them playing underneath the Oval Office desk and things like that. Jackie Kennedy actually lost a baby just a couple of months before President Kennedy's assassinated. So she was actually pregnant as First Lady of the United States. And even though there was this kind of perfect image that was being put out there, one of the things that's pretty well known about President Kennedy is his interest in other ladies. And so he is connected to probably the biggest starlet of the 1960s, a lady by the name of Marilyn Monroe. And a lot of it had to do with a little happy birthday song she sang him at Madison Square Garden. So check this out.
to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, Mr. President. Happy birthday to you.
You can probably see why Jackie Kennedy wasn't real happy about that. John F. Kennedy is president for 1,000 days. He is getting ready to start his reelection campaign in 1963, and he travels to the state of Texas. Now, his vice president was a guy named Lyndon Johnson. He was from Texas, and Texas had a lot of electoral votes, so that was going to be an important state for Kennedy to carry. And so he went down, toured a couple of different cities, and he winds up in November 22nd, 1963, in the city of Dallas, Texas. And as you can see from the picture, he's riding in an open-air convertible through crowds of screaming fans. Everywhere John Jackie went, there were tons of fans. Just read a book recently about how popular Jackie Kennedy was in Paris. She spoke fluent French, was a fashion icon. John Kennedy famously quipped when he gave a speech over there that he was known as the man who accompanied Jackie Kennedy to Paris. Well, they're riding in this car, just kind of waving at people, trying to get people excited about the election, and a couple of shots ring out. They're passing a building called the Texas Book Depository, just a big kind of textbook company type of building. And a man named Lee Harvey Oswald, who'd worked there, shoots with a sniper rifle and assassinates President Kennedy. Almost immediately, it's kind of trying to figure out who to blame. Did this guy act alone? Was he actually the guy that did it? Who was behind the whole thing? And there are things that conspired to make this one of those events in history that there are a lot of conspiracy theories that are around. Well, the only footage that exists of the Kennedy assassination is the Zapruder film, and I'll link that for you on the playlist as well, and so you can check out check that out. I will warn you, it's graphic. It slows down frame by frame, but you see President Kennedy being shot twice. I'm also going to link for you a scene from the film JFK. A guy named Oliver Stone in the 90s, late 80s, early 90s, makes this film JFK, where he puts out this theory that he had that it wasn't actually Lee Harvey Oswald that did it. There was another shooter. Seinfeld, if I can find that clip, I'll put it up there too, kind of lampoons it later with an episode they called the Magic Loogie episode. But when Kennedy dies, his assassin, or the person that they think assassinated, this guy Lee Harvey Oswald, is assassinated right afterwards. He's arrested, and as he's being taken to his arraignment, a man named Jack Ruby, who's a nightclub owner in Dallas, Texas, comes up and shoots him at point blank range and kills him. So you really don't get any answers from the guy who pulled the trigger. Jack Ruby dies pretty quickly. He had cancer, and so he dies. And so there are just all kinds of conspiracy theories. If you're into that sort of thing, a lot of rabbit holes you can go down that way. But the country's in shock, and the country will come together with television to watch the funeral procession. President Kennedy's buried in Washington D.C. at Arlington National Cemetery. There's a flame that burns above or at his grave site. Jackie will go and she'll get married again later in that decade, and then she died 1990s, I think. I remember seeing magazine articles and things when Jackie Kennedy passed away. There is this thing that people talk about called the Kennedy curse, which, if you remember, we talked about Robert Kennedy. His brother will be assassinated while running for president in 1968. Just recently, a couple members of the Kennedy family had a tragic accident, and it may just be one of those things that they're in the news more than your average American family, but it sure does seem like there's a more than their fair share of tragedy that hits that family. Like I said, the big deal with the Kennedy assassination is it destroys kind of this Camelot golden image of the country. And really, for the rest of the decade, from 1963 to 1975, which is what we consider to be the 60s, till the end of the Vietnam War, there's a lot of angst in this country. There's a lot of hostility, a lot of unrest that's going to happen, and a lot of people point back to the Kennedy assassination as to when that started.